Welcome to the historic Ocean House, a luxurious hotel that pays homage to New England's golden age of hospitality. With timeless elegance and renewed civility, this treasured resort is the setting for our special broadcast of the Ocean House Author Series. Each program features nationally best-selling and award-winning authors in a salon-style conversation, hosted by Ocean House owner, actress, and best-selling author Deborah Goodrich Royce. WCRI is pleased to partner with the Ocean House to present this ongoing series, which brings you the best and the brightest of the literary world. Now, let's take you to the Ocean House.
This event is being recorded by WCRI for future broadcasts and podcasts. So if everyone could please silence their cell phones, it is time for introductions. So Elliot Ackerman is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels Halcyon, 2034, Red Dress in Black and White, Waiting for Eden, Dark at the Crossing, and Green on Blue, as well as the memoir The Fifth Act and Places and Names. His books have been nominated for numerous awards, including the National Book Award, the Andrew Carnegie Medal in Fiction and Nonfiction, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a Marine veteran, having served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. He divides his time between New York City and Washington, D.C., and Elliot's featured book tonight is 2054. Welcome, Elliot.
Thank you.
We also have Joanne Leedom-Ackerman here, and she's a novelist, short story writer, and journalist whose works of fiction include Burning Distance, The Dark Path to the River, and No Marble Angels. Her recent nonfiction book, Pen Journeys, drew inspiration from her job as a vice president of the worldwide writers and human rights organization PEN International. She's also on the boards of the American Writers Museum, the International Center for Journalists, Words Without Borders, and Refugees International, as well as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Texas Institute of Letters. A native of Dallas, she has lived in New York City, Los Angeles, London, and Washington, D.C., and Joanne's featured book tonight is The Far Side of the Desert. Tonight's esteemed authors will be in conversation with Deborah Goodrich Royce. Deborah's thrillers examine puzzles of identity. Reef Road was a national bestseller and was named one of the best books of 2023 by Kirkus Reviews and an Indie Next pick by the American Booksellers Association. Ruby Falls won the Zibby Award for Best Plot Twist, and Finding Mrs. Ford was hailed by Forbes, Book Riot, and Good Morning America's Best of lists. She began as an actress on All My Children and in multiple films before transitioning to the role of story editor at Miramax, where she developed Emma and early versions of Chicago and A Wrinkle in Time. With her husband Chuck, Deborah restored the Avon Theater, the Ocean House Hotel, Deer Mountain Inn, United Theater, Martin House Books, and numerous Main Street revitalization projects in both Rhode Island and the Catskills. So I will stop talking. We will have our discussion now. After the discussion, we will open it up to questions from the audience. So for our folks listening in the future, just raise your hand. I'll come around with the mic so we can capture that. And without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Elliot Ackerman, Joanne Leedom-Ackerman, and Deborah Goodrich Royce.
Hi, everyone. I feel like this is the beginning of summer, and it's a joy to be sitting here with 2 slackers such as yourselves. I'm listening to this long list of things you've done. So I think it's always helpful for people, and it's always interesting to hear how authors describe their own books. So kind of your elevator pitch. Why don't you start, Joanne?
Okay. The Far Side of the Desert begins in Santiago de Compostela, which is in Spain, and it's a place where there's a retreat every year and a big festival. And 2 sisters, one is an international television journalist, the other works for the State Department and is in Cairo, have come together just to try to get a few days of vacation, and their brother is coming over from Washington. And there's this big festival, but at the festival, there are terrorist attacks. And one of the sisters has disappeared. And nobody asks for ransom. Nobody says where she's gone. The whole family, who's a diplomatic family who's lived around the world, starts looking for her. And the book really is the search for the person themselves, but really begins to be a search for identity for the various members of this family. And I often think in the writing I've done, I'm interested in sort of 3 circles of narrative. One is the outside story. And in this case, the outside story deals with terrorism, it deals with money laundering, trafficking of drugs and weapons. The inner story is the story of the family. this diplomatic family and the tensions thereof and their childhood. There's also a grandmother and a great-grandmother. You get that story. And then the inner story is the story of these two sisters and the tensions that's been between them and how these play to the end and play as the characters evolve. So it's really a character-driven international political thriller. That's the best I can do.
Okay, you did very well. Elliot.
2054, which is the book I'm discussing this evening, is actually the second book in a trilogy. So the first book in the trilogy is a novel called 2034, which came out a couple of years ago. And this is part of a broader project that I've been working on with my co-author, Admiral Jim Stavridis. And he's a career naval officer, and his last job was he was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, which basically meant he was the U.S. military officer in charge of NATO. And so this project we've been working on is basically 3 books that each deal with what we believe are sort of the 3 great challenges of the 21st century. So the first, 2034, dealt with this idea of peer-level warfare and it had a technological angle that dealt with a lot of cyber and how cyber warfare could really become an equalizer. The second book in this trilogy, 2054, deals with the idea of civil conflict in the United States and artificial intelligence and how that manifests in not only our individual consciousness, but the collective consciousness of a society. The last book in the series, 2084, will deal with the environment. So to sort of rewind back, and throughout all of these books, there are characters who kind of travel through the entire arc of the century with you, and there's some new characters who filter in. So if you're parachuting into our imagined 2054, what I would tell you is that the United States is reeling after the cataclysmic war that it fought with China, in which really neither side was the victor. But out of the ashes of that war, a very charismatic political figure emerges in the United States, a guy named Angel Castro, and he becomes president. He gets the U.S. sort of back on a stable footing, and he starts as an independent president, but he very quickly coalesces a political party around him, and that party is known as the American Dream Party, and sort of colloquially they're known as the Dreamers. And so when the book opens, Castro is looking at running for yet another presidential term. It would be his 4th term. So it's said of him in circles that Angel Castro views himself as being George Washington, but he'll never be Washington because he can't seem to get out of Washington. But the political landscape is not just Angel Castro and the Dreamers. We also are at a point in our politics where the Republican and Democratic parties, as they are now, have, so now they are actually 2 minority parties. You know, the plurality of Americans view themselves as independents. That doesn't mean they're a monolith, but they don't identify with either party. So that trend has projected forward into the year 2054 to the point where the Republican and Democratic parties become such small little rump parties. In order to survive, they actually have to merge, and they become the Democratic-Republican Party, united really only in the sense is that they are sure that they understand what is best for everybody else, and that they know the truth about everything, and their version of the truth is the right version of the truth. And so, as much as so that really the tension in American political life at that point is between the Dreamers and the Democratic Republicans, who are known as the Truthers. So truth versus dreams in America, and by the way, if that sounds far-fetched, you know, I would point to you that if we look at American political life, you know, there's long been, even in the 20th century, sort of very strange allegiances. You know, we had a Democratic Party in the U.S. mid-century where you had Northeastern liberals and Southern segregationists existing in the same party. But when the novel opens in its first chapter, President Castro steps up to a dais and he's giving a speech as he's about to announce that he is going to once again put himself forward as a candidate for the presidency, and he keels over. There are a lot of questions in the media. You can imagine the spin immediately, the spin on what happened to Castro is immediately shot out through the media sphere. Everyone's sort of angling for, you know, don't worry, he's fine, this is nothing, he just tripped on the stage, to, you know, he's dead and I know who killed him. And I don't think I'm giving too much away, this all happens in the opening pages. There's an autopsy done of President Castro, very quietly done. Nobody knows this is going on. And when the surgeon opens up his chest cavity and looks at his heart, he also has a photo of a CT scan that was done of the president's heart at his annual checkup about 2 months before. He looks at the heart of his hand, and he looks at the one of the CT scan. He says, "There's no way this is the same heart." And so it starts getting into these ideas of artificial intelligence, this idea of the singularity, the idea of what happens when our biological evolution starts fusing with our technological evolution, and not only what that means for our physiognomies, but also what it starts to mean about our collective consciousness, how we make sense of consciousness, and how any of us can agree as to not only what happened to a president, but maybe what should happen with our society writ large. And so those are sort of the macro themes of 2054.
We'll take a short break and be back with the Ocean House Author Series here on WCRI. And we're back with the Ocean House Author Series on WCRI.
I've read both the books, and I've loved both the books, and here you are, and we're going to point out, if anybody missed the point, we have a son and a mother here who are both highly accomplished in myriad aspects of life, including as authors, and specifically what we're focusing on here is you both are in a very particular, nuanced but particular geopolitical sphere. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that, Joanne. I loved what you just said about the circles, and how did you come at the far side of the desert? You talked about an entry point. You were in Spain, and you got to thinking about it. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Well, I've had a real privilege of being able to live abroad, to be in many, many different countries, and see the world from lots of different perspectives. Because I've been able to work with different nonprofits, not NGOs. I've been very involved with International PEN, which is a worldwide writers organization with centers in over 100 countries. I've worked with a group called the International Crisis Group, and on the board of Save the Children Care. And so I've been able to travel and just sort of see the world in different places. And I'm not as a tourist, but see what's happening. So I was in Santiago de Compostela. PEN International had their big annual Congress there, and it was in 1993. And it's the only time ever we've had metal detectors to get into the Congress, because we had a very high security guest coming, and their police and everything. And at that Congress, I had been elected to run the human rights work of International PEN. So I was sort of on the inner circle, and that guest was Salman Rushdie. And it was the first public appearance since the fatwa, I think, for Rushdie. And I was at a small dinner with Rushdie and others, and I began thinking, what would it be like to have your life just sort of taken from you, to be pulled out of your life? But it was a wonderful festival, so I started writing a short story just about the festival as I was sitting there, before the Congress started. And that's the beginning seed of it, was that question. And I had two sisters, and it didn't deal with Rushdie, but the question came from contemplating that. And I know that people say there are writers that are plotters, that plot it all out, and then there are writers who it sort of comes to. I'm more, I have a sense of where I'm going in a book, but I don't have the whole book. I don't plot it all out. And I find as the characters become alive to me and I see them, they begin to tell me what they're going, even though I have lots and lots of notes of where I think it's going. And this happened that way. As this one character got taken, I went, oh my gosh. And then as I thought, who took this character? And that was a very complex question. And that character, I really had to drill down and come to terms with this man named Stephen Arroyo or Safer Brahim. He has two names running in two different identities. And then there's a really bad guy in the book. And I really had to drill down and see who was this person. And I was a journalist in my early career. And so there's a journalist that's always inside me saying, but is that true? Do you know that's true? What are the facts? Do you know? And I would, I would say, get off my shoulder. Let me keep thinking. But I keep this list of facts to check, facts to check. And my imagination was taking me into the desert and into this camp. And I don't want to tell too much about the book, but I saw, where is this coming from? So I kept researching to see, is there anything like this? And lo and behold, I found, in fact, there was a paradigm. But I didn't start with the paradigm. I started with the imagination. So I'm constantly balancing the imagination, you know, the facts and the journalism, and the story begins to unfold. And the characters, as most novelists will tell you, do begin to inform the story and begin to direct the story. You know, you have the outline, but they begin to say, I'm not going there. This is where I am. And you go, oh, okay. So that was my experience.
A journalist asked me a question, because people do always say, are you a plotter or a pantser? Do you fly by the seat of your pants? And a journalist phrased it differently, and I like it. He said, do you chart your books with a map or with a compass? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a little subtler. I'm kind of a compass person. I have a direction. The other thing I want to say about that, Alice McDermott just wrote a book called What About the Baby?
Oh, no.
What About the Baby? About writing, and she distinguishes in one way nonfiction writing from fiction writing, in as much as in nonfiction, she points out the writer has to include everything. That's the whole point. You need all the facts. Whereas in fiction, the writer's imagination is infinite, so the job is actually to kind of contain it a bit, put a little wall around it, and we'll get to that. But so with you, Elliot, one of the things I so much enjoyed about 2054, I so enjoyed that you didn't go down the path of like futuristic outfits or kind of crazy kooky transportation, or where I felt like I was in the Jetsons and thinking about things like you really eschew all of that happily. And you're working deeply on characters, and where I think it has to be in the future, and you could not have set these books in the present or an earlier time, is the technology, is the biology. So talk a little bit about this idea of writing books set in the future and how you set your parameters.
Sure. It's funny because, you know, I've written these with the Admiral, and when we started doing this project together, the way we were matched up was we just by coincidence had the same editor at Penguin Press. And the Admiral had wanted to write this book, and his editor, our shared editor, said, you know, have you ever thought of working with a novelist on this? And, you know, I work with this guy named Elliot Ackerman, and our editor didn't know that the two of us were actually friends through Tufts, where we both went to college. But that being said, even though just because you're friends with someone doesn't mean you should write a book with them. And particularly when that someone was, you know, the Supreme Allied Commander. I mean, you know, I left as a captain from the service. You know, he was much higher than me, and so the idea of like arguing over adverbs with the Supreme Allied Commander did not appeal to me. So sometimes people will ask us and be like, you know, did you ever have any big disagreements at writing these books? And we've actually had a great, you know, really lovely partnership in all these books. But I will say the one thing we had a disagreement on was this exact issue, and it was about, and I'm not going to say, I'm going to be a gentleman, I'm not going to say who got their way, but it was about driverless cars. And because there was this issue, it was like how predominant, and there was a taxi in the scene, and this is actually in the first book, and should the taxi driver be there in this year? And so, but I will just say that for me, it's interesting because these books move forward. So 2034 is like really this work of speculative fiction. And we wanted to create a world that felt very much like now. And we were really embracing this idea of the uncanny. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that idea. It comes into like Freudian psychology, but it's basically, if I were to tell you that you were going to have a person working in your home who was going to help you out, but that person was going to be like a cyborg, like a robot, kind of like housekeeper. Would you rather have a robot housekeeper and they're both just as effective as one another, but one that looked like R2-D2 and made cute beeping noises and puttered around the house? Or would you want them that looked 99% like a human being but had shark eyes? And I think we probably all want like the R2-D2 that's cute, because the one that looks like 99% with the shark eyes, like it's almost there, but it's not all the way there. And that thing that our brain does, that like where it really freaks us out, that's the uncanny. And so we wanted the book to feel like 99% with the shark eyes. Like you're reading the book and you're like, oh, I know this street. I know this feels like right now. And then there's like this weird, but it's not like right now. That's sort of creepy. And so in 2034, we really tried to make it feel that way. But then what starts happening, and what's happened for us creatively, is by definition, the project has to start becoming something else. Because now we're 2054 and we're working on 2084, and so we have actually changed genres over the course of the project, because the last books are by definition science fiction, because you're so far out you can't predict with great accuracy what's going to happen, so you have to make some of these leaps. So I'm glad that it worked for you in 2054. We'll see if it works in the last book, but it's something we have had to contend with, because you're writing books that by definition need to feel different.
Do you find, let me, if I can insert a question, do you find that the continuity, though, is with character, because whatever year, decade, or whatever, people's characters are astonishingly consistent?
Well, yes and no.
Not the particular character, but just the characteristics.
Yes, but they're two different issues, because one is people, and yes, people don't change, but the other is the atmosphere of a book, and the atmosphere of the book is not something that is necessarily always character-driven. It's, it's what is it? What's going on geopolitically? How do you write in 2054 a book that's a political book? I mean, it's about dysfunction in the United States. So I immediately know, well, I'm going to tell a story. It's about dysfunction in the year 2054, and the Republicans are going to be the good guys, and the Democrats are going to be the bad guys. Like, I'm like, great, there go half your readers. So how do you create the atmosphere and the construct so you can tell a story that works? And how do you create an atmosphere in something that's, clearly a novel of science fiction, but it doesn't seem like the Jetsons and hokey? And a lot of that, it's almost like, it's taste. It's like you're decorating a room and you want to make sure it looks nice, with what are you going to include or what are you not going to include. So, so you have the characters, but then you also have to sort of create the world, and that, and that can be a challenge.
Yeah. So Joanne, speaking of characters, going to you. So you have these sisters, you have the family. What is your process for coming at character?
It's a good question. And I think every novel and every character is answered a little bit differently. Some I just have the voice. Once you get the voice, as all writers will tell you, once you have the voice, you're on the road. And that's the narrator, the language they use, the way they tell you things. And when you don't have the voice. So if I don't have the voice, I know it's not working. I just keep building. I keep saying, in building backwards, because sometimes with the really bad guy in this book, I had to go all the way back to childhood. Where did this person begin? What were the building blocks of this person's life that led them to that point? And some characters, I sort of just know them quickly. But very often those, and for me in the novels I've written, usually the antagonists, I find I have to spend more time understanding them, because you don't want them just to be types. You want to really have them be people that you might not like, but you can relate to. And so I just take lots of notes. I look all around. I try to think, what might they look like? Sometimes I'll even look in a magazine and say, is that who that could look like? Because I want to see them physically as well. I think of people I know. I'm never writing about people I know, but sometimes their characteristics. And it's just building it. And you've got it when they start talking back to you. And you recognize the voice. You say, okay, that's their voice. That's the way they sound.
I think that's true. Having been an actress long ago in a land far away, I always approach character in the way an actor does, sort of the method approach. What is exactly what you're saying? What is the motivation? And I think it is, for a writer as much as an actor, a way of getting at all of the characters in a book. And so for you, Elliot, you are building this cast of characters. Do you sort of have a Bible where you know who Julia Hunt is and who she's going to be, and you plan her out? Because you must have to have a lot of planning to create a trilogy.
I'm a compass person too, so I have notes that I take. But yes, you're keeping track of who they are and you know who they fundamentally are. Then you wind up kind of telling this much longer arc for each of the characters. And I think once you know what a story is about or the book is about, that's, you know, you feel kind of very grounded in that. And then when you understand where they need to go, I think it becomes, you know, easier to write them. So so I don't have like a big Bible or a whole bunch of notes, and I kind of have notes that I make at the bottom of drafts. But I think for the books themselves, what's been fun for us is to, you know, like in 2054, one of the central characters is this woman who you mentioned, Julia Hunt, and her mother is one of the central characters in 2034, and her mother sort of appears in 2054. So about half the characters in 2054 are either in 2034 or are sort of the progeny of the characters who were in 2034, and there's new characters. And so it's sort of, you know, we are now getting to the end of writing the last book in this series, and what's sort of been fun for us as we look back, I'm like, wow, the last, you know, 5 years, we've basically written 1,000, you know, yes, we've written 3 books, or you can look at this, we've written like a 1,000-page multi-generational novel, which is also what the book is about. So as much as, you know, I'm up here and I'm telling you about the book for a few minutes, so it's easier to situate in that way of, you know, here are the crises. It's also a book that is fundamentally about kind of 4 or 5 families over 100 years almost, so, or 50 years rather.
So it could be serialized.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 60 years. I'm a writer, not a mathematician. So,
Right.
yeah, 60 years.
So I want to talk a little bit about life and writing and having these different chapters. You each, as you know, is demonstrated, you've had many things that you've done. Are you primarily, we'll start with you, a writer? Are you primarily a novelist? Are you, you are involved with all kinds of humanitarian efforts. You're a journalist. How does it all come together for you? And did all those things feed into the writer you are?
I think a writer and a mother. You know, I think you have to add that. People used to say to me, "You're so disciplined to be a writer," because I write every day. I said, "No, I'm so disciplined to be a mother," because that was important. Because that really fed it too. Having family, watching family grow up, and that was important. But I began as a journalist, and there's part of me that always is a journalist, and I recognize that in every piece of fiction I've written, somewhere, maybe not the main character, is a journalist. It's like that's a person watching over things, checking the facts, you know, whatever. In my novel Burning Distance, it's the mother who's the journalist. She's not the main character, but she's an important character. In another novel I've written, it's a side character. But there's always that person who's looking at what's actually happening, checking the facts, making sure they're right. That's not the novelist. I think primarily myself as a novelist. And a lot of the other work I've done has just been I think just what's important to me has taken me to it. I grew up in the South in the 50s and 60s. I was very stirred by civil rights, even when people around me weren't. I can't tell you why, but even as a little girl. And I would be arguing with my father and my classmates and everything. I was very stirred by women's rights. These things just, as a person, I didn't study it so much, it just touched me. And so following that thread into doing human rights work and, you know, working in education around the world just was following something that was important to me. And as I tell people, you live long enough, you do a lot of things. I mean, you know, it sounds a lot on paper, but you know, you lived a long life, so you do a lot of things.
I say the same thing. I don't think I don't know about you. We don't do all the things we do all at once. We tend to do things sequentially. And Elliot, with you, how did you go into the military? You stayed for a long time. It's a major part of your life, and it's got to have an influence on everything else.
No, it does. I think it's funny. The people will often say to me, like, Elliot, it's so odd. You know, you went from being this kind of, you know, gun-toting commando to being a writer, and that seems like really weird. And a lot of people don't do that. But the people who have known me the longest will say, Elliot, it's so odd. You were like this, like, very creative skateboarding, like, teenage kid, who didn't do great in school, and then you like cleaned up your act and like ran off and joined the Marines. and so, I kind of very much believe in that old Walt Whitman saw, we all contain multitudes. And I think, when I psychoanalyze myself, I can very clearly kind of see all of the connections. But yes, I think at different times in your life, you are engaging more directly with different parts of your personality. Like if you'll indulge me in an anecdote, I used to have, when I was in the Marines, particularly in the early days after I'd like cleaned up my act and gotten it together to go into the Marines, I would have for years in the Marines this reoccurring nightmare about every 6 weeks or so, or every couple months. I don't think it wasn't that bad, but I would be in my nightmare. I'd be like back at the skate spot, or I'd be like out surfing, and my hair would be long. I would like kind of be doughy and out of shape. I'd be hanging out with all my ne'er-do-well friends again, and we'd probably be doing stuff we shouldn't be doing, particularly if you're a Marine. And I'd like wake up at like 3:50 in the morning, and like touch my hair, and I'd have like my high and tight, and I'd look at my alarm, and be like, oh good, I'm going to wake up in 10 minutes to go run, and and I'm like, okay, I still got it, I've still got the edge. And then I got out of the Marines, and I've never had that dream since. Now I have a different dream, and the dream I have now, and every couple of months, because I live this creative life now, it's much more unstructured, is I will have this dream. And I will be back in Quantico, Virginia, at like training area 10 with my pack on my back, doing the land navigation course, running around the woods, looking for like the compass box that I need to find, or else I'm going to fail out and they're going to make me an administrative officer and my life will be hell. And I have that dream, and I wake up and I'm like, oh, I'm not in the Marines anymore. And so again, when I psychoanalyze myself, I think that is actually probably the subconscious part of my brain that doesn't get used. Like when I was in the Marines, the creative part of, a certain part of my brain just wasn't getting, my free spirit, I wasn't engaging with that. And so that was like waking me up in the middle of the night and be like, I'm still here, and and now I have that dream, and it's like the old Marine being like, don't worry, I didn't go anywhere, I'm still here. So
I like that. I feel like my life has been very episodic, and I think that is more who we are as human beings now. I think time was middle of the 20th century, whether you had the job in the corner office or on the factory floor, odds were, I think particularly for men, that there was going to be a length of time in one job, and I don't think that is as true anymore for anybody. Before we open to questions, I want you to talk a little bit about process. We know that you're each Compass people, but how do you, people always want to know, how do you plan your day? When do you write? Do you get up in the morning? Do you do it every day? You did say every day, but how do you structure your life around writing, Joanne?
I'm not sure structure is the right word, but I do write every day. In my best days, I look at my calendar and nothing is on it. And I can sit and write for 6 to 7 hours. I mean, that's an ideal. That's probably my creative time. If I can get 6 or 7 hours, that's good, but it doesn't always work. So, but my best days, I would start writing at 9, I'd be done by about 3 or 4, and then I'd do all the other work. I used to teach, so, teaching was for about 15 years, I taught writing and other courses. Or I'd be writing articles, or I'd read. I mean, a writer has to read. I mean, you have to find the time to read, because that's also what feeds you. And if you really hit a dead spot or a blank spot, and I tell this to young writers or even experienced writers, that one recently came and said, I'm just stuck, I don't know what to do. And I'd say, well, pick your best book off the shelf and start reading, and read what you've written, because reading is feeding you. I would also say to amplify your question, young women, as I'm sure talk to you as they do to me sometimes, and because of this quandary, and my answer usually is you can have it all, but not necessarily at the same time. So, just don't be patient with yourself. Realize this is what I'm doing now. This is important. This is what I'm doing now. This is important. And so you feed it. But I do always try to find time. When I was a mother, I would get up at 4:30 in the morning, and I would go to a restaurant that was open, and I would work, for several hours at least. And I had a very supportive husband, or at least an agreeing husband, and I would say, you got to give me Saturdays. I have to have some time that's just mine, and I would go out and just work for 7 or 8 hours. Just finding the time, and or go out at night. I had a good marriage, fortunately, because I would go out dinner was done, the kids were put to bed, I would leave about 8 o'clock at night, and I would go out and work till midnight. I'd find a restaurant that was open, and I would work and come home about 12:30. And all I was doing was writing. I mean, fortunately, but he was sound asleep, the kids were sound asleep. So somewhere finding that time to do the writing, because if you're a writer, you have to be writing. I mean, you have to be practicing your craft.
And then there are those times. I had editorial notes, and I had made a plan to revise a book. And the day I was going to sit down with revisions, my mother was hospitalized, and I brought my computer to her hospital room every day for the first week. And as I was trying to do my revisions, she would want to talk to me, and I'd say, "Mother." And within a few days, I closed my computer, and I'm so glad I did, because my mom had a 6-week final illness, and then she died. So it's been an extraordinary period, and I do think we have those times when
you have to do other things.
You have to attend to what is going on. So it's been a strange year. So Elliot, how do you organize your day, your time? Talk about writing alone, writing with another person. Are you in the same room? How is it all working for you?
Well, Jim and I, we just do go draft to draft with each other. So when I'm writing, I'm off on my own doing it. We're not like sitting in the same room together writing. But my wife is a writer. She's a novelist and a screenwriter. So I see their different way. We have very different processes. So I think everyone just sort of has to figure out what works for them. I actually have always maintained that being a Marine is an excellent preparation for being a writer, because you get the discipline, and I think discipline actually kind of matters, at least for me it does, because you show up. And I think for anything in life, I think showing up is like 90% of it. So for me in my life now, just showing up at my desk. So if I am working, of course there's periods in the summer, or when I'm with my kids, I'm like, I'm not working right now. So if I'm not working, I'm not working. But when I am working, I'm on a project my wife says I'm kind of like a coal miner. I go down there every day and I just plod, and I'm and I'm going to come out of the mine with 1,000 words a day, whether they're good or bad. That's just my marker. And if I do that, I've sort of made my marker for the day. And so I'll do that Monday to Friday, read over what I've done on the weekends, and kind of plod along towards my goal, and then go back and revise. So it's not. There's no me standing up on a mountaintop waiting for the muse to kind of whisper in my ear very seductively. It's very, very plodding in my household, and not particularly romantic. But I feel like that's actually how it gets done, And if you do that, and there's projects I've started. I have a whole book graveyard on my computer of things I've written 150 pages of and just thrown away, or it's 70 pages of something, and I walk away from I don't really think it's going to work. But I feel you have to do that so you get to the good stuff. So yeah, that's sort of my
I love the book graveyard. I think we all have that graveyard. Definitely.
Yeah.
We'll take a short break and be back with the Ocean House Author Series here on WCRI. And we're back with the Ocean House Author Series on WCRI.
I think we're ready to take it out to questions from the audience. How many of you are writers? I always feel that there are writers in the room, secret writers, unacknowledged writers. You don't have to raise your hands, but yep, there you are. Yes, you have a question, or you're a writer? You're a writer. Okay, who has a question?
The fact, mother-son writers.
Yeah.
And then you went into the Marines. So was there a defining moment when you said, I want to be a writer? How did that happen for you?
I'd been in this service for about 8 years, I kind of was coming to the conclusion that I was sort of like I had a very a very tough but a positive experience. The closest analogy I'd say it's kind of like being a professional athlete, and you get to a certain point where you're like, am I going to leave this and go do something totally different, or am I going to double down and this is all I want to do for the rest of my life? And many of my greatest friends who I deeply respect, like this is all they've done for their life, and that's great. I kind of basically was like, I want to go do something else. And so I didn't know what that something else was. But I knew going into the service, and I've always like read books and been a bit of a reader, that there were some books that I picked up that really meant a lot to me about service, like Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, or a book by Jim Webb, Fields of Fire. They were about the experience I had had, and I'd read those books before I went into the service, and they were novels or works of fiction, and I read them actually after I'd been to war, and they resonated for me in a different way. So I sort of had this idea of like, well, I don't want to write a memoir that's kind of one of these books that's like, no shit, there I was, and like, I want to write like one of these types of books. That some 17-year-old version of me in however many years might pick up and be like, oh, this is what it was like. Because I very much had this sense coming out of those experiences that I now was the custodian of that experience. So if someone wants to know what it was like to go fight in Iraq and Afghanistan in 20 or 30 years, they're going to, I hope they'll have a book that's the books that I picked up, which were all by the Vietnam generation. So I wanted to try to write that book. And so I very quietly, as I was figuring out my life, set about trying to do it. I didn't tell anyone I was writing a book, because telling someone I wanted to write a book or even be a writer at that point, because I had nothing to show for it, it felt like telling people, like, I want to dance. Like it felt silly. So I didn't tell anybody I was doing that. And I finished that book, this very close to the bone autobiographical novel. I gave it to sort of a friend who I'd met in the political job I was working at the time, who read it. He had worked in publishing. He was a very cantankerous old guy. I'll tell you his name, you might know who he was, but he actually said to me when he finished reading it, I quote, "Elliot, I read your book. I don't think it's a piece of shit." So I said, great, high praise. And I only say this, there are, so I got an agent very, very quickly. The book went out on submission to 26 publishers. I was like, this is great. People say this is hard. This is easy. And it got rejected by 26 publishers. And that close to the bone autobiographical novel has actually never been published. And I just bring that up because I feel like writers don't talk enough about the things that don't work for them. But by that point, I had beat my head so bloody against. So I was actually like, I think I want to write books. And actually, my father, who's no longer alive at one point, said to me, I don't think he knew he was challenging me, but he said to me, "So you wrote that book. You think you got 2 books in you?" And I was like, I got 2 books in me. So then I wrote and someone gave me the advice when I finished that book and it hadn't been published and I was still figuring things out. Said, I can't remember if someone said this to me or I read it somewhere. Said, the best thing to do when you finish your project is to immediately start your next project, if you can, because it will allow you to be sane as that one finds its life. So in my life since then, I have also tried very much to, and this is much easier said than done, but if one can do it, it's important to separate my writing life from my publishing life, because they are actually 2 different things.
If I can amplify his answer with
do,
a mother's perspective, because I might have been the one who said that, but I can remember Dick Snyder said that, but it's absolutely true. But the thing that I remember is Elliot, when he finally showed me his writing and said, "Do you think I should go get an MFA?" And I said, "Well, Elliot, I said, Elliot, I do this and I teach this. And I know I'm your mother, but you are really good. You don't need an MFA. You need an agent and a publisher. But I don't know if it'll get published. I don't know how successful you'll be. I don't know if you'll be touted. But even if you are, that will not fill you up. If you love to write, then do it." He said, "I love to write." So that's it. And that's true for any writer in the room or not. The important thing is loving the work you're doing. And the rest is wonderful, but there is a separation of writing and publishing. They are sometimes different worlds.
It's so true. I mean, you have to think about, why am I doing this? What is the point? And the point is, those days, and they are tough, when you think you've said something that you wanted to say in the way that you wanted to say it. However you phrase that is very fulfilling. I've got a question here.
Semper Fi, Elliot. My son served in the Marines in Iraq.
Okay.
A question that maybe you could just touch on a little bit is an important aspect that you wanted to portend in this book about the juxtaposition of humanity or the human condition with the science and the aspects of AI.
Sure. Well, I hope the book doesn't. One of the themes that the book, that 2054 certainly engages with, is this idea of how our biological existence and our psychological existence are sort of one, and how we don't understand in a democracy, or we're not actively aware all the time in a democracy how it's fundamentally based on a common sense of reality. Doesn't mean you agree, but there always has to be this sort of basic foundational agreement on reality. So as technology keeps pushing forward and we look at sort of just these trends, one can extrapolate that our ability as just a society to exist in shared realities is being challenged. And I think we see that like every single day, whether it's our news reality, whether how fractious our cultures become, where we have tons and tons, we got lots of movies, but nobody's watching the same movies, lots of news, but nobody's reading the same news. And if we keep projecting that out, it becomes very, very difficult to exist in a democracy, because a democracy is predicated on some type of shared reality, shared values, even if we disagree about the direction that we should go. So that is, I'm speaking very broadly, but that is sort of what the book kind of gets into, themes, and particularly with some of the technology that we discuss and that you see previewed in the book, at least how we imagine it existing in 2054.
I have a question. As a mother writer and a son writer, how much do you share of the projects you're working on? While you're working on them, do you let each other read them? Do you, collaborate together with ideas, not on the book itself, but just bouncing ideas off of each other? And
I think in the early days when Elliot was first writing, I did read early. I read several, probably the first 5 novels I read early on and gave my thoughts and notes. But now he has a wife who's a writer, a top editor, an agent. So I read them. I plead to see the galleys or the arcs that come. But so I haven't read the last 2 or 3 books. But I think the first 5 I read in early stages, and I have Elliot read mine at some stage along the way. But if having a daughter-in-law who's a writer who had a book come out in January named Ilium, Lee Carpenter. My book came out March 5th. Elliot's came out March 12th. And people say, you must have very literary conversations. And I say, here's our conversation. You pick up ice hockey, I can get soccer, and who's getting the pizza? I mean, it's... you can answer your own.
Yeah, I think, a bit on the margins, but I think we also are our family first. So
yeah.
It's kind of nice to leave your work life at work. So.
We have time for one more question before we get books signed. And I would strongly suggest you get both books. Strongly.
Yeah, it's a Sophie's choice, isn't it?
Yeah. No, you got to leave here with both.
He has to catch an early train, though, so if he leaves out, you can buy mine.
Okay, I'll ask you a question. Are you comfortable talking about what you're working on now? Maybe you're working on 2084. Do you want to talk? How do you feel about that, or is that verboten?
I'm happy to. The thing I'm most actively working on right now is actually a new series called. It's basically it's going to be a sort of I think a fun book. It is an espionage series. It's going to be about 2 sort of down on their luck former CIA officers who are turned international repo men. So they basically repossess jets, boats. They get a 5% commission on it. One is an American whose nickname is the Squirrel, SKWREL, because Marines can't spell, and he used to be a Marine. And the other is an Afghan pilot who has fled since the end of Kabul. His name is Cheese. because his call sign in the Afghan Air Force was the Big Cheese, Aziz Iqbal. And so it opens up, and these two guys are basically trying to make a living in the shadowy world of international repossession because they can't get jobs doing anything else. And as you can imagine, hijinks ensue when they repossess the wrong jet. So, so that's sort of, and it's called, and the title, they get their taskings from the title of the series is called Sheepdogs. And that's sort of a military, it's sort of a saw that exists in the U.S. military, which is that the world is, three types of people exist in the world. There are sheep, who are the majority of us who walk around sort of thinking that evil is kept at bay and nothing will happen to us, we're always fine. And then there are the wolves, and wolves are the people who prey on the sheep. And the last are the sheepdogs who protect the sheep from the wolves. So these guys are the sheepdogs. So anyways, that's what I'm working on.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Joanne?
My pleasure is that I've been writing for quite a long time, and the books haven't always gotten published right away. So I actually have two manuscripts. I just met with my agent yesterday in New York, and one is called Washington Days, Beirut Nights, and it's, I don't want to tell too much about it because when it gets this published, and the other is called California Story, which had it been published when I first wrote it would have been very prescient because it's a big mystery where this major mogul suddenly disappears and nobody knows if he's killed, if he's been murdered, if he's disappeared, and the wife is left with that. And it looks at the real changes that were happening in the whole media industry back in the late 80s. But it's taken so long before it's going to be published that it's going to be very much of a historical novel, I think, when it comes out. But so I have two, and we'll see if they go out. And then I have a third that I am working on.
Well, thank you both. It has been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this special broadcast of the Ocean House Authors Series with Deborah Goodrich Royce. Please tune in each month as we'll bring you a new Ocean House Authors Series highlighting nationally best-selling and award-winning authors in a salon-style conversation. Hosted by Ocean House owner, actress, and best-selling author Deborah Goodrich Royce. The WCRI is pleased to be partnering with the Ocean House to bring you this ongoing series highlighting the best and the brightest of the literary world. Thank you once again for joining us. And in the words of Margaret Atwood, in the end, we all become stories.